In May of 1919, China's Tiananmen Square witnessed massive student demonstrations against the Treaty of Versailles. Under the treaty, Germany's colonies in China had been transferred to Japanese control rather than China's new republican government. And these protests sparked off a movement that embraced democracy, science, and socialism in China. But 70 years later, another massive protest movement, which started in the Tiananmen Square to embrace democracy, was violently crushed by the Chinese government. Welcome to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we look into the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests, how they started, and what led to the military coming in to crush the movement. For nearly a decade after the passing of Mao Zedong in China, the Chinese society and economy underwent a lot of changes. On the social front, the Chinese saw themselves through to higher education, and on the economic front, massive foreign investments started pouring in. And as a result of these two combinations, students as a whole emerged as a powerful political force within the country. Higher education was flourishing, and so was the economy, but the government was still authoritarian. So while the Chinese government was focused on educating its citizens and opening up the economy, the political system was kind of virtually status quo. And two political leaders who had risen to prominence in the post-Mao era were Yaobang and Deng Xiaoping. Both had been twice purged and twice rehabilitated during Mao's era, but now were looked upon as leaders most likely to engineer change. Deng Xiaoping was the de facto leader in China now, and his protege, Yaobang, was gradually rising through the ranks. In June of 1981, Yaobang was elevated to the chairmanship of the Chinese Communist Party, replacing Mao Zedong's handpicked successor, Hua Guofeng. And this marked the Chinese leadership's broad acceptance of pragmatic programs which were designed to speed economic growth. Yaobang further became a symbol of the new pragmatism within the Chinese Communist Party when he abolished the post of the party chairman that Mao Zedong had held at the Communist Party Congress in 1982. The emphasis here was on collective leadership rather than the personality cult that Mao Zedong had established. And while students started emerging as a political force, they started pushing for a democratic government across China. Subsequently, in December of 1985 and 1986, Beijing and Shanghai witnessed student protests in support of democracy. They held banners with slogans such as "Law, not authoritarianism" and "Long live democracy." Surprisingly, the People's Daily, China's state-owned newspaper, expressed sympathy with the protesters, but it made it clear that the limits of official toleration were being approached. And within the official channels of the Chinese government, Yaobang was coming under tremendous pressure to suppress and quell these student protests. But the reformist that he was, Yaobang felt that dissent by the intelligentsia was normal and needed to be tolerated by the communist government. Whoa, wait. Are we saying that within a decade of Mao's passing, China was making a 180 degrees turn? Well, overall, the reform movement within the Chinese government was very measured. But within the leadership, there were a few reformists who were more democratically inclined than the rest. But these were a very small minority, and that is why in January of 1987, Yaobang was forced out of office by the hardliners in a very humiliating way. He was charged with encouraging student dissent by refusing to crack down on the protests. Interestingly, Hu Yaobang was replaced by another liberal leader, Zhao Ziyang. So Zhao became the general secretary of the Communist Party and Li Peng was appointed premier. Zhao firmly believed that China's market changes could succeed only if they were accompanied by political liberalization. Now, he was not advocating outright democracy, but more of shrinking the party's role so there would be more tolerance for opposing views. Now, almost 2 years after his ouster, Hu Yaobang died of a heart attack on April 15, 1989. There was a very brief mention of his death, and the government did not give any indication of giving him a formal state funeral. And this was the event that triggered students from Beijing marching towards the center of the Tiananmen Square. Having learned from the past, this time the students were shouting only government-approved slogans, but they were calling for the restoration of Hu Yaobang's reputation, that is, giving him a proper state funeral. The government was surprised at the goodwill and popularity that Hu Yaobang seemed to have garnered within the student community. So, bowing to the pressure, the government agreed to accord Hu Yaobang a state funeral. So, while the preparations were being made for Hu Yaobang's funeral, a delegation of the protesting students tried to petition the government with their demands at the Great Hall of the People. The Great Hall of the People is a state building situated to the west of Tiananmen Square in Beijing and is normally used for legislative and ceremonial activities by the Chinese government. So, what were these student delegates petitioning about? Well, they had a set of demands which are often referred to as the 7 demands, and these included more governmental transparency, press freedom and end of censorship, increased funding for education, and removing restrictions on demonstrations. But government officials refused to meet with these student delegates, who waited patiently for 3 days at the Great Hall of the People. And this would prove to be a flashpoint in the student demonstrations. So while Hu Yaobang's subdued memorial service took place on April 22nd, 1989, there was a massive increase in the number of students demonstrating within Tiananmen Square, swelling up to 100,000 students. The students were extremely upset at being ignored by the government. The hardliners within the government grew nervous, but General Secretary Zhao Ziyang believed that the students would disperse once the funeral ceremonies were over. So he proceeded on a week-long trip to North Korea for a summit meeting. But while the students were enraged at the government's refusal to meet with them, they had also gotten emboldened by the meek reaction of the government to their protests. So they continued to protest, and their slogans started straying further and further from the government-approved slogans. With the moderate Zhao Ziyang out of the country, the hardliners saw this as an opportunity to influence leader Deng Xiaoping with their opinions. The hardliners, led by Premier Li Peng. Deng himself was a reformer and initiator of the market reforms. But the hardliners exaggerated the threat posed by the students, with Li Peng falsely claiming to Deng Xiaoping that they were calling for the ouster of the communist government. Deng Xiaoping got influenced and decided to denounce the demonstrations in an editorial published on April 26, 1989 in the People's Daily. He called the protests Dongluan, meaning turmoil or rioting by a tiny minority. Now, these terms in China were associated with the atrocities committed by Mao Zedong during the Cultural Revolution. So instead of de-escalating, the editorial inflamed the situation. And there was another factor that came into play. With the protests labeled Dongluan, if the students ended the protests, there was a high likelihood that they would get prosecuted. So until the government withdrew that characterization of these protests, the protesters were not going to leave Tiananmen Square. But the editorial itself had been authored by Deng Xiaoping, and it was highly unlikely that he was going to withdraw the editorial and take a credibility hit. Meanwhile, General Secretary Zhao Ziyang returned from North Korea and found the entire country engulfed in this crisis. And he chose to immediately defuse the crisis by trying to persuade Deng Xiaoping to withdraw his editorial. But Premier Li Peng intervened to block the suggestion, arguing that taking any step back would be a show of weakness by the Communist Party leadership. So while the Communist Party leadership was debating the issue, students from other cities started pouring into Beijing to join the protests. And on May 13, 1989, the students took a very critical step. They announced a hunger strike with the goal of getting the government to retract the April 26 editorial by Deng Xiaoping. Over 1,000 students took part in the hunger strike, and all of a sudden, there was widespread sympathy for the protesters across China. The Chinese government met in an emergency standing committee session the following day to evaluate the situation. Zhao Ziyang urged the party leadership to accept the students' demand and withdraw the editorial. Li Peng urged a crackdown. With the standing committee deadlocked, the final decision was passed on to Deng Xiaoping. The next morning, Deng Xiaoping announced that he was placing Beijing under martial law. General Secretary Zhao Ziyang was fired and placed under house arrest. Jiang Zemin, a hardliner, succeeded him as the General Secretary, and Premier Li Peng was placed in control of the military forces in Beijing. And while this was going on, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev arrived in China for talks with Zhao on May 16. And along with Gorbachev came a whole contingent of foreign journalists and photographers. And all of a sudden, these protests garnered international visibility and sympathy. There were calls for restraint, and a lot of sympathetic protests erupted in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and expatriate Chinese communities in several Western nations. In the morning of May 19, 1989, the deposed General Secretary Zhao Ziyang made an extraordinary appearance at Tiananmen Square. He spoke through a bullhorn and he told the protesters, "Students, we came too late. We are sorry. You talk about us, criticize us. It is all necessary. The reason that I came here is not to ask you to forgive us. All I want to say is that students are getting very weak, and it is the 7th day since you went on a hunger strike. You cannot continue like this. You're still young. There are still many days yet to come. You must live healthily and see the day when China accomplishes the 4 modernizations. You're not like us. We are already old. It doesn't matter to us anymore." And this was the last time Zhao Ziyang was ever seen in public. Zhao's appeal did have an impact, and many students from Beijing started leaving the square. However, reinforcements from the provinces continued to pour into the city. A new set of student leaders took over and took a more hardline stance, calling for the protests to continue until June 20, when a meeting of the National People's Congress was scheduled to take place. On May 30, the students set up a large sculpture called the Goddess of Democracy in Tiananmen Square. It was modeled after the Statue of Liberty and became one of the enduring symbols of this protest. Upon hearing that the protests were continuing in Tiananmen Square, on June 2, 1989, the Communist Party elders met with the remaining members of the Politburo Standing Committee and agreed to bring in the People's Liberation Army, that is the PLA, to clear the protesters out of Tiananmen Square by force. With Zhao Ziyang out of the way, the voices of the moderates within the Communist Party had been muffled forever. On the morning of June 3, 1989, the 27th and 28th Divisions of the People's Liberation Army moved into Tiananmen Square. They used tear gas to disperse the demonstrators, but they had been strictly ordered not to shoot the protesters. These two divisions had been selected because they came from distant provinces. The Chinese leadership was concerned that local PLA troops could be sympathetic to the protesters. Not just the students, but also tens of thousands of workers and ordinary citizens of Beijing came together to repel the army. Burned out buses were used to create barricades, rocks and bricks were thrown at the soldiers, and some of the tanks were even set ablaze. In the end, the first casualties of Tiananmen Square were actually soldiers. To the students, it was now clear that there was going to be a showdown with the army. So they had a tough decision to make. In the end, they chose to hold their ground. That night, around 10:30 p.m., the army returned. This time with rifles and firing indiscriminately, while tanks rumbled down the streets. Chaos immediately ensued, and several bystanders were killed while they tried to rescue the wounded. Just a clarification here, the bulk of the violence took place in the neighborhoods all around Tiananmen Square rather than in the square itself. Throughout the night of June 3 and early hours of June 4, the troops bayoneted and shot protesters, while tanks drove straight into crowds, crushing people and bicycles under their treads. By 6 a.m. on June 4, 1989, Tiananmen Square and the streets around it had been cleared. There was widespread shock across Beijing. Parents of missing students tried to push their way to the protest area looking for their children, only to be warned off and then shot in the back as they fled from the soldiers. Doctors and ambulance drivers who tried to enter the area to help the wounded were also shot down in cold blood by the army. Several foreign journalists and photographers watched in horror from their hotel balconies. But on the morning of June 5, 1989, when all of Beijing seemed utterly subdued, an amazing thing happened. A young man in a white shirt and black pants, carrying shopping bags in each hand, stepped out into the street and stood in front of the tanks. The lead tank tried to swerve around him, but he jumped in front of it again. While everyone watched in horrified fascination, afraid that this tank man would meet the same fate as others, the tank man climbed up onto one of the tanks, telling the soldiers, "Why are you here? You caused nothing but misery." After several minutes of this defiance, two men rushed up to the tank man and hustled him away. What happened to him after is unknown. However, still images and video of this defiance were captured by the Western press members and carefully smuggled out of China for the rest of the world to see. These images and videos became a lasting impression of the Tiananmen Square tragedy. The immediate effect of this act of defiance was felt thousands of miles away in Eastern Europe, when in 1990, several Baltic states started breaking away from the Soviet Republic. The official death toll of the Tiananmen Square massacre, provided by the Chinese government, is 241. But the unofficial estimates put this figure between 800 and 4,000 people killed. The Chinese Red Cross actually put a toll of 2,600 based on counts from local hospitals, but then quickly retracted that statement under intense pressure from the government. But the follow-up to this tragedy was even more devastating for the common man. A lot of the student leaders ended up in jail for 10 years. Professors and other professionals who had joined in the protests were simply blacklisted and were unable to find jobs. And a large number of workers and provincial people were executed. However, when Beijing issued a wanted list of ringleaders of the protests, activists in Hong Kong set up Operation Yellowbird in mid-June 1989 to help these activists escape from China. This operation, which had due support from Western intelligence agencies, politicians, celebrities, and business people, helped more than 400 student activists escape to the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and other Western nations. For the Chinese government, this was a watershed moment. Reformists within the Communist Party were stripped of power and reassigned to ceremonial roles. Former General Secretary Zhao Ziyang was never rehabilitated, and he spent the final 15 years of his life under house arrest. Upon his death in 2005, though, his personal diary was smuggled out of China and published into a memoir titled Prisoner of the State. The memoir records his thoughts and recollections on what happened behind the scenes during the critical moments in modern China history. Political reform continues to be a taboo subject in China, and the Tiananmen Square tragedy has been virtually expunged by the government from history. Any websites that talk about this incident are blocked in China. And it is on that note that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Which American company transitioned from building machine guns and B-29 propeller assemblies during World War II to home appliances like washer dryers and dishwashers after World War II? After World War II, as new home buyers needed appliances to fill their homes, Frigidaire, which was a division of General Motors, promptly responded to that need. So the answer is B, Frigidaire. Question for the current episode. What were the 4 modernizations referred by Zhao Ziyang when he addressed the Tiananmen Square protesters? Were these A, finance and banking, computer tech, national defense, and manufacturing? B, space exploration, banking tech, computer tech, and shipping? C, nuclear tech, national defense, space exploration, and industry? Or D, agriculture, industry, science and technology, and national defense? Once again, what were the 4 modernizations referred by Zhao Ziyang when he addressed the Tiananmen Square protesters? Were these A, finance and banking, computer tech, national defense, and manufacturing? B, space exploration, banking tech, computer tech, and shipping? C, nuclear tech, national defense, space exploration, and industry? Or D, agriculture, industry, science and technology, and national defense? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. We meet again in 2 weeks with another interesting and exciting episode on world history. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.